What would you do if your world were a small, isolated battlefield between God and the devil? If every ruined harvest, every childhood illness, every shadow in the forest was not a random act, but a direct attack by the forces of hell? What would you do if the pointing finger of a girl in the throes of a seizure could send you to the gallows? Imagine the biting air of New England, sharp with the scent of firewood and fear. Hear the austere silence of your home, broken only by the whisper of prayers and the crackle of the fire, as outside the wind howls like a wolf. Feel the constant gaze of your neighbors, judging your every word, your every action, searching for the slightest crack in your piety. Suddenly, a scream rips through the night. It is not a cry of physical pain, but something worse. A cry of spiritual terror that signals the beginning of the end. This is not a horror story. This was the suffocating reality for the people of Salem Village in the winter of 1692. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a witch hunt. It is the harrowing, step-by-step account of how a devout community consumed itself, and how fear can turn faith into a deadly weapon. To understand the madness of Salem, you must understand the powder keg on which they lived. It was a perfect storm, waiting for a spark to ignite. First, there was their mindset. They were Puritans, exiles who had crossed an ocean to build a biblical city upon a hill, a beacon of godliness in a savage wilderness. But they saw this world as a literal battleground against Satan. The devil was not an abstract idea. He was a real, active presence, constantly seeking to infiltrate their community, tempt the weak, and destroy their sacred experiment from within. The invisible world of spirits, angels, and demons was as real to them as the chair they sat on or the soil they tilled. Second, there were the tensions that poisoned their relationships. A bitter rivalry existed between the agricultural, poorer Salem Village and the prosperous, mercantile Salem town. Within the village itself, disputes over land boundaries and family resentment simmered beneath a thin veneer of forced piety. Entire families hated each other in silence. And third, there was trauma. The community lived in terror of recent, brutal attacks by Native Americans during King William's War. Refugees who had witnessed massacres, who had seen their families slaughtered, lived among them. Add to this political instability, as the colony had lost its charter and was living in a legal limbo. Add recent smallpox epidemics. The result was a paranoid, isolated society living on the brink of a psychological collapse. The madness that would engulf Salem did not begin with a fiery sermon from the pulpit, nor with a diabolical pact by moonlight. It began with whispers, secrets, and forbidden games in the kitchen of the town reverend. Picture the scene. It is the harsh New England winter. In the dark, smoky kitchen of the Reverend Samuel Parris, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, seek a distraction from the tedium and rigidity of their lives. They are enthralled by the stories of their slave, Tituba, a woman brought from the Caribbean. She tells them tales of her homeland, teaches them fortune-telling tricks, small rituals of folk magic. For the girls, it is a thrilling, forbidden game. But the game goes wrong. The girls begin to have strange, violent fits. They contort into impossible postures. They scream nonsensical phrases and blasphemies. They hide under furniture, crawl on the floor, and bark like dogs. The terrified Reverend Parris calls the local doctor, William Griggs. The doctor examines the girls but can find no physical cause for their afflictions. And then he delivers a diagnosis that will change history. He declares the girls are under an evil hand. That phrase was the spark. The medical diagnosis not only validated the community's deepest fears, but transformed what might have been a psychological issue or an elaborate teenage prank into an act of supernatural warfare. The pressure on the girls becomes unbearable. Magistrates, ministers, and neighbors surround them, interrogating them relentlessly. The question is always the same, hammered over and over. Who torments you? Who is doing this to you? At first, the girls are silent, but fear, confusion, and constant pressure finally break them, and they whisper the first names. The first 3 women accused were not chosen at random. They were a perfect reflection of the Puritan community's prejudices and fears. They were the easiest targets, the socially acceptable scapegoats. First, Tituba, the slave. She was an outsider, a woman of a different race and culture, already suspect for the stories she told. The perfect other, Second, Sarah Good. She was a homeless beggar, an impoverished, resentful woman who often muttered curses when denied alms, a social outcast. And third, Sarah Osborne. She was an elderly, sickly woman who rarely attended church. Worse, she had defied social and legal norms by attempting to claim her first husband's inheritance for herself, disinheriting her own sons. A rebel. But the real fuel poured on the fire was Tituba's confession. After days of interrogation, and most likely torture at the hands of Reverend Paris, Tituba does not just confess to being a witch. She gives the magistrates exactly what they want to hear, a spectacular and terrifying narrative. She speaks of flying on a broomstick to attend witches' meetings. She speaks of a tall man from Boston who is the devil. She describes signing her name in blood in Satan's book. And most importantly, she reveals she is not alone. She confirms there are other witches in Salem, a satanic conspiracy operating in their midst. This confession changed everything. It was no longer just the fantasies of a few girls. Now they had proof. The threat was real, organized, and growing. With this confession, the afflicted girls undergo a transformation. They cease to be passive victims of an invisible evil. They become the central figures of the drama, the heroines of the story. They are the only ones who can see the specters of the witches. They become oracles, human detectors of the devil's presence. In a society that normally rendered them invisible, they suddenly found themselves with unimaginable power, the power of life and death. Who were these afflicted girls who became the engine of the hunt? Were they Machiavellian actresses who discovered a power game and played it to its ultimate conclusion? Or were they victims of mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon we might today call conversion disorder, where mental stress manifests in real physical symptoms? The truth is likely an inextricable mix of both, but what is undeniable is that, very quickly, their accusations began to follow the lines of the family feuds and squabbles that already existed in Salem Village. The girls became, consciously or not, living weapons used by adults to settle scores, to attack neighbors with whom they had disputes over land or power. At first, the accused were the outcasts, the pariahs, but the web of accusations began to spread like a disease. Soon, it reached respected and devout members of the community. The moment that shocked everyone was the accusation against Rebecca Nurse. She was a 71-year-old woman, the matriarch of a respected family, and known to all for her piety and good character. Her accusation proved a terrifying new reality. No one was safe. Not reputation, not a lifetime of faith, not the respect of your neighbors could protect you. To be accused became synonymous with being guilty. The judicial system improvised in Salem to deal with the crisis was built on a terrifying legal foundation, a logical trap impossible to refute. Spectral evidence. Imagine the scene in the meeting house, which served as the courtroom. The room is packed, the air thick and cold. The magistrates, like the aggressive John Hathorne, interrogate the accused. But the real spectacle is the girls. They sit in the front row. The moment the accused enters or looks at them, they begin to scream. They writhe on the floor, complaining of being pinched, bitten, choked. They claim that the specter, or the spiritual form of the accused, invisible to everyone else in the room, is attacking them at that very moment. This was spectral evidence, the testimony of a victim that an accused person's spirit was tormenting them, even while that person's physical body was across the room, proclaiming their innocence. The court, led by the unyielding Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted this evidence as irrefutable fact. It was a perfect trap. How can you prove your spirit was not somewhere attacking someone? How can you refute the invisible? This created a diabolical dilemma for every accused person, the famous Salem Catch-22. You had two options, and both were hellish. If you confessed to being a witch, you lied and betrayed your soul, but the court spared your life. They believed that by confessing, you had sided with God, but to prove your repentance, they demanded you name other witches, thus perpetuating the madness and condemning other innocents. If you maintained your innocence, if you told the truth as your conscience dictated, you were defying the court's authority. You would be found guilty of witchcraft based on spectral evidence, and you would be sentenced to die on the gallows. Throughout the summer of 1692, Salem's judicial machinery accelerated, turning suspicions and specters into death sentences with brutal, methodical efficiency. The first to be executed was Bridget Bishop. Imagine her journey in a cart through the village streets, towards the rise known as Gallows Hill. Hear the sound of the crowd, a mix of jeers, insults, and nervous prayers. Feel the tension as the rope is placed around her neck. 19 more people would follow her path to the gallows, men and women who refused to lie to save their lives. Some, on the scaffold, showed a courage that sowed the first seeds of doubt. The Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem, was accused and convicted. At the gallows, to the astonishment of the crowd, he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, something it was believed no witch or agent of the devil could do. His execution nearly started a riot. Active opposition to the hysteria became a death sentence. John Proctor, a respected farmer and tavern keeper, was one of the first to publicly denounce the girls as frauds. Swiftly, he and his pregnant wife were accused. Proctor was hanged. But the most harrowing story is that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. Knowing that if he were convicted of witchcraft, his lands would be seized by the state and his sons left with nothing, he devised one last, terrible form of resistance. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. He stood silent before the court. Archaic English law had a punishment for this, peine forte et dure, to be pressed to death. They took him to a field, stripped him, laid a board across his chest, and one by one, placed heavy stones upon it. For 2 days, they tortured him to enter a plea. His only response, according to legend, was a grunt. More weight. He was crushed to death, but he died uncondemned, and his lands passed to his sons. His death became the most brutal symbol of the court's tyranny. Who was behind this madness? Intellectually? Let us pause on Cotton Mather, the most influential minister in Boston. He was a brilliant intellectual, a Harvard graduate, and a fervent, absolute believer in the reality of witchcraft. His writings, which detailed cases of witchcraft, helped create the intellectual climate that made the Salem hunt possible. He legitimized the persecution, yet Mather also privately expressed concern over the rampant use of spectral evidence, warning that the devil could assume the shape of an innocent person to deceive the afflicted. He embodied the conflict between the intellectual belief in witches and the messy chaos of the trials. And it is important to remember that what happened in Salem, though terrible, was a late echo and on a much smaller scale of the great witch hunts that had swept across Europe in previous centuries, where tens of thousands were executed. Yet, the story of Salem, because of its detailed documentation and its occurrence in the New World, became the universal archetype of mass hysteria and religious persecution. The hysteria that had consumed Salem crumbled under the weight of its own grotesque excesses. The madness stopped when the accusations became too ambitious, and the silent doubt of many grew into a public outcry. Imagine the atmosphere in the autumn of 1692. The harvests are half gathered because so many farmers are in jail or dead. Farms lie abandoned. The economic life of the community is paralyzed. People begin to wake as if from a nightmare. They look at their neighbors with a mixture of guilt, shame, and fear. The church pews, where the condemned once sat, are empty. The definitive turning point came when the girls, emboldened by their unchecked power, began to accuse untouchable people. They accused wealthy Boston merchants, ministers from other towns, and finally, the wife of the governor of Massachusetts himself, William Phips. The governor, who had until then allowed the trials to run their course, intervened immediately. Suddenly, the threat had become personal. He dissolved the special Salem court, formally banned the use of spectral evidence, and gradually, the remaining prisoners were released. The death machine ground to a halt. The aftermath was long and painful. Years later, public apologies came. Judge Samuel Sewall stood up in his church and begged forgiveness from God and men for his role in the tragedy. One of the chief accusers, Ann Putnam Jr., wrote a public confession, read before the congregation. In it, she blamed the devil for deceiving her and asked forgiveness from the families of the victims. Salem was forever scarred. A devout community, which had come to the New World seeking purity, was destroyed not by witches, but by itself. Imagine walking through Salem today. Beside the souvenir shop selling witch hats stands the solemn, silent stone memorial with the names of the 20 innocent victims etched for eternity. The air no longer smells of firewood and fear, but the ghosts of 1692 are still there. A quiet reminder that the line between faith and fanaticism is dangerously thin. Salem is more than a dark chapter in American history. It is a timeless cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, groupthink, and moral certainty. It shows us how societies, in times of great stress and fear, can create scapegoats to blame for their problems, destroying innocent lives in the process. Witch hunts did not end in 1692. Where today do we see similar dynamics of public accusation, moral panic, and the destruction of reputations based on fear rather than on evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this journey has shaken you, subscribe to Chronicles of Steel. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.